The unexpected journey begins. General Maya Richardson stood at the crowded airport terminal, her sharp military uniform a symbol of pride and a beacon of attention. The cacophony of boarding announcements, bustling passengers, and the occasional overhead laughter of travelers enveloped the space. Maya had returned from a grueling overseas deployment, her mind preoccupied with thoughts of home and the family awaiting her arrival. She adjusted the duffel bag on her shoulder, feeling the weight of it dig slightly into her uniformed frame. Despite her exhaustion, a sense of relief filled her. Months away from her husband, Eric, and their two children, Olivia and Malik, had been emotionally taxing. The promise of reunion kept her grounded during the most challenging days. Her husband, a stay-at-home dad and her constant source of support, had sent her a flurry of texts before her departure. He never failed to remind her of how proud he and the kids were of her. Olivia, their 14-year-old, had recently joined the debate team, while 6-year-old Malik, as mischievous as he was endearing, had made it his personal mission to master tying his shoelaces. Maya's thoughts were interrupted by the chime of an announcement. First-class boarding for Flight 175 to Atlanta is now open. She pulled out her boarding pass and smiled faintly. It had been years since she'd allowed herself the luxury of first class, and this ticket was a hard-earned gift to herself after months of hardship. As she approached the gate, the young attendant smiled warmly. "Good afternoon, General Richardson. Enjoy your flight." Maya nodded in acknowledgement, appreciating the recognition. The young woman's cheerful demeanor gave her hope that this would be a smooth journey. But her optimism waned when she reached the jet bridge. Standing at the entrance was a tall man in a pressed suit, his arms folded, his face cold and scrutinizing. His name had read D. Walker, Airline Security. "Ma'am," he said curtly, stepping in front of her path. His eyes darted to her uniform, then to the boarding pass in her hand. "Can I see your ticket?" Maya raised an eyebrow, but handed over her pass without hesitation. His tone wasn't unfamiliar. It was a tone she had encountered countless times in her career, dismissive and questioning, as though her very presence in a first-class line was a mistake. Walker stared at her ticket longer than necessary, his brows furrowed in apparent disbelief. He let out a small, disapproving hum. "Ma'am, this is a first-class ticket." "I'm aware," Maya replied, her voice steady but firm. He looked up at her, his gaze hardening. "You sure this is your seat? Perhaps you meant economy. I suggest you check again." Maya's heart pounded, not in fear but in controlled anger. Years in the military had taught her patience and restraint, yet moments like this tested every ounce of it. "I'm certain," she said. "Now, if you'll kindly step aside, I'd like to board my flight." Walker didn't move. "Listen, General or whatever, I don't know how you got this ticket, but first class isn't where you belong. Economy is right over there." He motioned dismissively to the other side of the terminal. Nearby passengers began to glance over, their curiosity piqued by the exchange. Some whispered among themselves, while others watched intently, their expressions a mix of confusion and discomfort. Maya straightened her posture, towering slightly over him. Her gaze met his, unwavering. "Mr. Walker, I paid for this seat, and I intend to sit in it. If there's a problem, I suggest you escalate this to someone who can resolve it. Otherwise, I'll proceed." Walker's face tightened, and for a moment, he faltered. But then his lips curled into a sneer. "You people think you can just waltz in here like you own the place because you wear a uniform. Newsflash, that doesn't impress me. First class isn't handed out because of diversity quotas." A wave of shock and outrage swept over Maya, but she refused to let it show. She had encountered men like Walker before, ignorant, bigoted individuals who viewed her accomplishments as exceptions, not norms. "I've earned everything I have," she said, her voice low but commanding. "Including this ticket." The tension was palpable as the confrontation unfolded. Before Walker could retort, a soft but firm voice interrupted. "Is there an issue here?" Both Maya and Walker turned to see a flight attendant approaching. Her name tag read Kara. She had a warm presence, her tone calm yet authoritative. "I was ensuring this passenger was in the correct seat," Walker replied, his voice laced with condescension. "Her ticket says first class, correct?" Kara asked, her gaze shifting between them. Walker hesitated, clearly displeased. "It does, but—" "Then there's no issue," Kara said sharply, cutting him off. She turned to Maya. "General Richardson, I apologize for the inconvenience. Please allow me to escort you to your seat." Walker stepped back reluctantly, muttering under his breath. Maya's resolve didn't waver as she followed Kara into the plane. "Thank you," Maya said quietly when they reached her seat. "No thanks needed," Kara replied, a note of sincerity in her voice. "But if there's anything you need during the flight, just let me know." As Maya settled into her seat, she glanced out the window. The earlier confrontation played over in her mind. It wasn't new, but each time it happened, it felt like a reminder of the battles she faced daily, not just in the military, but in life as a black woman in America. This wasn't just about a seat on a plane. It was about respect, dignity, and the right to exist without prejudice. And Maya Richardson wasn't one to back down from a fight. Not now, not ever. As the plane's engines roared to life, she made a silent promise to herself. This incident wouldn't end here. Confronting the shadows, the rhythmic hum of the airplane's engines did little to soothe the storm brewing in General Maya Richardson's mind. Sitting in her first-class seat, she stared out of the oval window at the endless expanse of clouds, her reflection blending with the muted hues of the sky. Despite the luxurious comfort surrounding her, the confrontation with D. Walker replayed in her mind, each word echoing with a weight she couldn't ignore. The sting of his words wasn't new. She had encountered such prejudice before, cloaked in politeness or blatant hostility. Yet this encounter felt different. It wasn't just about being questioned. It was the audacity with which Walker tried to undermine her accomplishments, her identity, and her very presence. This was supposed to be a journey home, a rare respite from the rigors of deployment. Instead, it had turned into another battle, one she hadn't anticipated. The flight attendant, Kara, had checked on her twice since takeoff. Each time, her kind words and thoughtful gestures reminded Maya that allies existed in unexpected places. Yet Maya's mind remained restless. She wasn't just angry for herself, but for all the others who had been told, in ways large and small, that they didn't belong. As the plane cruised at 35,000 feet, Maya found herself replaying moments from her life when she had been challenged to prove her worth. Growing up in the South as the youngest of 3 daughters in a working-class family, she had learned early on that strength wasn't just physical, it was mental, emotional, and spiritual. Her parents, both teachers, had instilled in her a love for learning and an unyielding belief in justice. Her father often said, "Maya, the world won't always see your worth. That's why you need to know it for yourself." Those words had carried her through some of the toughest moments in her career, from grueling training sessions in the sweltering heat to strategic decisions on the battlefield that could mean life or death for her team. She had always risen to the challenge, knowing her actions spoke louder than words. But there was something about the casual dismissal she faced today that gnawed at her. It was the culmination of countless smaller injustices, being talked over in meetings, having her authority questioned, and feeling the need to work twice as hard to be seen as equally capable. A flicker of support. "Excuse me, ma'am," came a voice from the aisle. Maya turned to see a middle-aged man standing hesitantly beside her seat. He was dressed in a button-down shirt and slacks, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed. "I just wanted to say, I saw what happened back there, and I'm sorry you had to deal with that." Maya was taken aback by his unexpected words. She studied his face for signs of insincerity, but found none. His eyes held a genuine apology, not for something he had done, but for what he had witnessed. "Thank you," she replied, her voice steady. My name's David," he said, glancing around as if worried he might draw unwanted attention. "I've flown with this airline for years, and I've never seen anything like that. It wasn't right." Maya nodded, appreciating his attempt to bridge the gap. "No, it wasn't," she said, "but it's not uncommon." David shifted uncomfortably, as though grappling with the weight of her words. "I hope you file a complaint," he said. "People like him shouldn't get away with treating anyone like that." "I intend to," Maya said, her resolve hardening. She wasn't just filing a complaint for herself. She was doing it for every person who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. As David returned to his seat, she felt a small flicker of hope. Perhaps this incident could be more than a personal affront. Perhaps it could spark something larger. Memories of the past. The soft click of the overhead speaker announced the beginning of meal service, and Maya leaned back, closing her eyes. Memories of her early days in the military floated to the surface, unbidden but vivid. She thought of the first time she stepped onto a base, a young woman full of determination, but painfully aware of how few people looked like her. She remembered the subtle ways her competence had been questioned, like the time a senior officer asked if she had family connections to secure her position, or the time she was told, "You're lucky we're letting you take the lead on this. Don't mess it up." Luck, Maya thought bitterly, as if her countless hours of training and unwavering dedication were reduced to chance. But she had never let their doubts define her. Instead, she used them as fuel, proving again and again that she deserved her place, not because of luck, but because of grit, intelligence, and an unshakable sense of purpose. The weight of representation. As the flight attendants began serving meals, Maya was offered her choice of entree. Kara once again leaned in with a quiet word of encouragement. "If there's anything you need, General, don't hesitate to call on me." Maya thanked her, grateful for the woman's kindness. She picked at her food, her appetite dulled by her racing thoughts. The weight of representation settled heavily on her shoulders. It was a weight she had carried for years, often without realizing it. Whether in the military, in civilian life, or now on this flight, her presence challenged the status quo. She didn't just represent herself. She represented the possibility of change, the idea that someone like her could succeed in spaces where she was often told she didn't belong. She thought about her children, Olivia and Malik. What kind of world was she creating for them? Olivia was already beginning to navigate the complexities of adolescence, her confidence tested by the subtle and not-so-subtle prejudices she encountered. And Malik, with his boundless curiosity and infectious laugh, deserved to grow up in a world that valued him for who he was, not judged him for what he looked like. Maya clenched her fists. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about ensuring that the next generation wouldn't have to fight the same battles she had. Planning the next step. By the time the plane began its descent, Maya had made a decision. She wouldn't let this moment slip into the shadows of forgotten incidents. She would file a formal complaint with the airline. Yes, but she would also take her story further. She had seen firsthand the power of speaking out, how a single voice could ripple into a wave of change. She pulled out her phone and began drafting a post for her social media account. It was a carefully worded account of the day's events, one that focused not just on the confrontation, but on the broader issue of discrimination in everyday spaces. "Today, I was told I didn't belong in first class, not because I didn't have a ticket, but because someone decided I didn't look like I belonged. This isn't just about me. It's about the countless others who faced the same prejudice, day after day, in airports, offices, schools, and beyond. I've spent my career serving my country, breaking barriers, and proving that people like me belong wherever we choose to be. It's time to call out these injustices and demand better, for all of us." She read the draft several times, ensuring it struck the right balance between personal experience and broader advocacy. With a deep breath, she hit post. An awakening. As the plane landed and taxied to the gate, Maya felt an odd mix of exhaustion and resolve. She retrieved her bag from the overhead compartment and walked briskly toward the exit. Walker was stationed near the door, his expression tight and unreadable. He didn't meet her gaze, and she didn't give him the satisfaction of acknowledging him. The terminal was a sea of movement, But Maya's eyes immediately found her family. Eric stood tall, his warm smile breaking into a wide grin as soon as he saw her. Olivia and Malik bolted toward her, their laughter and shouts filling the air. In that moment, the weight on her shoulders lifted slightly, replaced by the comforting embrace of her family. But as much as she cherished this reunion, Maya knew her journey wasn't over. She wasn't just coming home. She was stepping into a new fight, one that would require every ounce of courage and resilience she had. And Maya Richardson had never backed down from a fight. The catalyst for change, the warmth of her children's embrace, and the sight of her husband's welcoming smile filled General Maya Richardson with a sense of peace, but it was fleeting. As they navigated through the crowded terminal, the earlier confrontation lingered in her mind like a bruise that wouldn't heal. Maya was used to challenges. She had faced them on the battlefield, in military boardrooms, and in countless moments when her abilities were questioned. But this was different. This wasn't just an attack on her. It was an attack on the principles she had spent her entire life upholding. As they approached the parking garage, Eric noticed her distant expression. "Maya," he said softly, his hand brushing hers, "you've been quiet since you landed. Did something happen on the flight?" Maya hesitated, her children's chatter filling the space around them. She didn't want to dampen the moment, but Eric knew her too well. He could read the tension in her face, the tightness in her shoulders. She nodded toward Olivia and Malik, who were walking ahead of them, eagerly recounting their adventures while she was away. "Later," she murmured. Eric gave her a knowing look but didn't press further. The aftermath of prejudice. Later that evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Maya and Eric sat in their cozy living room. The soft glow of the fireplace flickered across the walls, and the room was quiet except for the occasional hum of the wind outside. Eric handed her a steaming mug of chamomile tea, his way of signaling that he was ready to listen. Maya took a sip, the warmth steadying her nerves. "There was an incident at the airport," she began, her voice calm but tinged with frustration. "One of the airline security staff. He tried to block me from boarding first class. He said I didn't belong there." Eric's jaw tightened, his hand resting on hers. "Did you report him?" "I plan to," Maya said. But it wasn't just what he said. It was how he said it. The look on his face, the assumptions he made. It wasn't about the ticket or the uniform. It was about what he saw when he looked at me. Eric leaned back, his face thoughtful. "You've dealt with this before. But this time feels different, doesn't it?" Maya nodded. "It does. I'm tired, Eric. Tired of having to prove myself over and over again. Tired of being questioned in spaces I've earned the right to be in. And it's not just me. It's every person who's ever been told they don't belong because of the color of their skin, their gender, their identity. It's systemic, and it needs to stop." Eric's eyes softened. "So what are you going to do?" "I've already started," Maya said, setting her mug down. She pulled out her phone and showed Eric the post she had written earlier. It had gone viral, garnering thousands of likes, shares, and comments in just a few hours. Messages of support poured in from people who had experienced similar injustices, their stories raw and poignant. "I'm not just filing a complaint," Maya continued. "I'm turning this into something bigger. This isn't just about one man or one incident. It's about the culture that allows this kind of behavior to persist. And I'm going to challenge it." Eric's lips curled into a small smile, pride evident in his eyes. "You've always been a fighter, Maya. Whatever you decide to do, I'll be right here." Igniting a movement. The next morning, Maya woke to find her phone buzzing incessantly. Her post had taken on a life of its own. News outlets were reaching out for interviews, advocacy groups were offering their support, and countless individuals were sharing their stories of discrimination in everyday spaces. Maya felt a mixture of pride and responsibility. This wasn't just her story anymore. It was theirs. It was a collective call for change, and she was at the center of it. She spent the day responding to messages and coordinating with Kara, the flight attendant who had intervened during the incident. Kara had reached out privately, expressing her full support and offering to provide a statement if needed. "I've seen this kind of behavior before," Kara admitted during their call. "It's not isolated, General. It happens more often than you'd think, and it needs to stop." "Thank you, Kara," Maya said, her voice steady. "Your support means more than you know. And please, call me Maya." Kara chuckled. "Maya, then. Just know you're not alone in this." The public response. By the end of the week, Maya's story was dominating headlines. Morning news shows debated the implications of her experience, while social media erupted with hashtags like #WedAlong and #MayaMovement. Her inbox was inundated with messages of support, but also backlash. Some accused her of overreacting, claiming she was making a mountain out of a molehill. Others sent hateful messages, their words dripping with prejudice and anger. Maya refused to be deterred. She had faced worse in combat zones. Words wouldn't break her. They would only fuel her determination. One evening, she received a message from an attorney named Eleanor Briggs, a civil rights lawyer known for taking on high-profile cases. The message was concise but powerful. "General Richardson, your story has brought a critical issue to light. If you're interested, I'd like to discuss the possibility of pursuing legal action, not just for yourself, but for the systemic changes we both know are needed. Let's talk." Maya stared at the message, her heart pounding. Legal action. She hadn't considered it before, but the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. Change wasn't just about raising awareness. It was about holding institutions accountable. Meeting the advocate. 2 days later, Maya found herself sitting across from Eleanor in a sleek downtown office. Eleanor was a striking woman in her late 40s, her tailored suit exuding confidence and professionalism. She wasted no time getting to the point. "Your case is significant," Eleanor began, leaning forward, "not just because of what happened to you, but because it reflects a systemic issue that needs to be addressed. Airlines, like many industries, have a long history of implicit bias and discrimination. This isn't just about you. It's about setting a precedent." Maya listened intently as Eleanor laid out her vision. They would file a lawsuit against the airline, not just for the discrimination Maya had faced, but for their failure to train employees adequately to prevent such incidents. The goal wasn't just compensation, it was systemic reform. "This will be a fight," Eleanor warned. "They'll try to discredit you, paint you as opportunistic. Are you ready for that?" Maya's gaze didn't waver. "I've been fighting battles my whole life, Eleanor. I'm ready." The fight begins. Over the next few weeks, Maya and Eleanor worked tirelessly to build their case. They gathered statements from witnesses, reviewed the airline's policies, and connected with others who had faced similar discrimination. The more they uncovered, the more evident it became that this wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern. At the same time, the public response continued to grow. Maya's story had become a catalyst for a broader movement. Grassroots organizations began organizing protests at airports, demanding anti-bias training for airline staff. Petitions calling for systemic reform garnered hundreds of thousands of signatures. The #Maya movement became a rallying cry for change. Through it all, Maya remained steadfast. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every person who had been told they didn't belong. And she wouldn't stop until they were heard. The tides of resistance. The days leading up to the lawsuit's announcement were a whirlwind for General Maya Richardson. The magnitude of the movement she had ignited was evident in the flood of support she received from across the nation. But with the outpouring of encouragement came a surge of resistance. The backlash was intense, and for every person who celebrated her courage, there was another who sought to undermine it. Maya spent hours poring over messages, emails, and articles. Some accused her of exploiting her military status for personal gain, while others dismissed her story entirely, arguing she was making everything about race. The worst of the vitriol came in the form of anonymous threats, cowardly attempts to silence her with hate-filled words. Her husband, Eric, became her anchor during these turbulent times. Late one night, as Maya sat in their study scrolling through another barrage of negative comments, Eric entered, a mug of tea in hand. "Still at it?" he asked, setting the mug down beside her. Maya sighed, rubbing her temples. "It's like fighting a war on two fronts. For every step forward, there's a pushback trying to shove us back into silence." Eric knelt beside her, his hand resting on her knee. "Maya, you've faced enemies with weapons and won. Don't let people with keyboards and small minds get to you. What you're doing matters. Don't forget that." Maya looked into his steady gaze, drawing strength from his unwavering support. "You're right," she said softly. "I just wish I didn't have to keep explaining why this matters." "You don't have to explain to everyone," Eric replied. "You just have to keep leading. The people who need to hear your voice will follow." Rallying allies. The following week, Maya met with Eleanor Briggs and a coalition of civil rights advocates in Washington, D.C. The conference room was abuzz with energy, a mix of lawyers, activists, and community leaders, all focused on the same goal: turning her personal battle into a nationwide movement for systemic change. Eleanor stood at the head of the table, her presence commanding. "We've drafted the lawsuit, and we're ready to file," she began. "But this fight isn't just legal, it's cultural. The airline will use every resource at their disposal to paint this as a one-off incident. Our job is to prove it's part of a pattern." Maya nodded. "I've heard from hundreds of people who've experienced similar discrimination," she said. "Their stories are heartbreaking. It's time to make sure they're not just stories, they're evidence." A man seated across the table, Marcus Lee, a seasoned activist, chimed in. "We've organized protests at major airports. The first one kicks off next week at LAX. Media coverage is already lined up. This isn't just about one lawsuit. It's about reshaping how people think about bias and privilege." Maya listened intently, her resolve hardening with every word. She knew this wasn't just her fight anymore. It was a collective battle, one with far-reaching implications. "Let's do it," she said firmly. "No more waiting. No more excuses. We move forward." The media storm. The day the lawsuit was filed, the media storm erupted. Headlines splashed across screens and papers. "General Maya Richardson sues airline for racial discrimination." "Military hero takes on corporate bias." And "a call for equality takes flight." Maya appeared on several major news networks, her calm demeanor and eloquence captivating audiences. Sitting across from a seasoned anchor during one of the interviews, she answered tough questions with unwavering poise. "General Richardson, some critics argue that you're blowing this incident out of proportion. How do you respond to that?" the anchor asked. Maya leaned forward slightly, her eyes steady. "I understand why some people might feel that way. But let me ask them this. How many times have they been questioned about their right to be in a space they've earned? How many times have they been told, either directly or indirectly, that they don't belong? For some of us, it's not just one incident. It's a lifetime of being underestimated and dismissed. This isn't about one seat on one flight. It's about dignity, respect, and ensuring that no one has to fight for their humanity in places where it should be a given." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of her words settling over the audience. The interview ended with applause, and Maya returned home to find her inbox flooded with messages. Among them was a video from a young woman named Aisha, a high school senior aspiring to join the Air Force. In the video, Aisha held up a sign that read, "Because of you, I believe I can fly." Tears welled in Maya's eyes as she replayed the message. Aisha's words reminded her of the stakes. This fight wasn't just about the past. It was about shaping the future. The legal battle begins. The courtroom was packed on the first day of the trial. Reporters filled the gallery, their pens poised to capture every moment. Maya sat at the plaintiff's table beside Eleanor, her military uniform a testament to her discipline and integrity. The airline's defense team, a group of seasoned attorneys led by a brash senior counsel named Richard Ellis, wasted no time in trying to discredit her. Their opening arguments painted the incident as a misunderstanding, a moment of poor judgment rather than systemic bias. When it was Eleanor's turn, she spoke with precision and conviction. This case is not about a single misunderstanding. It's about a pattern of behavior that reflects a larger cultural issue. General Richardson is not the first person to face this kind of discrimination, but with your verdict, she can be the last. As witnesses were called, the evidence mounted. Kara, the flight attendant who had intervened during the incident, testified on Maya's behalf. Her voice was steady as she recounted the events, her words leaving no doubt about what had transpired. The video footage, captured by a fellow passenger, was played for the court. Gasps filled the room as Walker's dismissive tone and prejudiced remarks echoed through the speakers. The airline's defense team shifted uncomfortably, their carefully crafted narrative beginning to unravel. The turning point. On the third day of the trial, Maya took the stand. She spoke about her career, her family, and the countless moments when her capabilities had been questioned because of her identity. Her voice didn't waver as she recounted the incident on the plane, her words cutting through the courtroom like a blade. "This isn't just about me," she said, her eyes meeting those of the jury. "It's about every person who's been told they don't belong. It's about a system that allows people to make snap judgments based on race, gender, and appearance. We can do better. We must do better." By the time she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Even the most skeptical jurors seemed moved by her testimony. Building momentum. Outside the courtroom, the movement continued to grow. Protesters gathered at airports nationwide, their signs bearing messages like "Equality takes flight" and "Bias has no place here." Social media buzzed with support for Maya, her story inspiring others to share their experiences and demand change. Maya knew the fight was far from over, but as she stood on the steps of the courthouse, surrounded by supporters, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about a lawsuit. It was about creating a world where no one had to question whether they belonged. As the trial reached its midpoint, Maya braced herself for the challenges ahead. The airline's defense team would fight tooth and nail to protect their image. But Maya was ready. She had spent her life fighting battles, and she wasn't about to lose this one. Breaking the silence. The courtroom was silent except for the occasional shuffle of papers and the soft murmur of voices in the gallery. General Maya Richardson sat at the plaintiff's table, her back straight, her uniform immaculate. The trial had entered its second week, and the tension in the air was palpable. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads, while spectators watched every move, their expressions a mix of curiosity, outrage, and hope. Across the room, the airline's defense team huddled together, their faces taut with frustration. Their strategy, attempting to downplay the incident as a misunderstanding, was unraveling. Each piece of evidence Eleanor Briggs presented, each witness she called, painted a clearer picture of systemic bias within the airline's operations. As Maya sat beside Eleanor, she couldn't help but reflect on how far this fight had come. What had started as a humiliating confrontation on a jet bridge had grown into a national movement. People across the country were rallying behind her, sharing their own stories of discrimination and demanding change. But with that support came pressure, the weight of expectation that she could not afford to falter. The cross-examination. On the fourth day of the second week, D. Walker, the security officer who had denied Maya her seat, was called to the stand. As he walked to the witness box, his posture stiff and his face impassive, Maya felt a surge of emotion. This was the man who had looked her in the eyes and told her she didn't belong, not because of anything she had done, but because of who she was. Eleanor rose from her seat, her demeanor calm but commanding. "Mr. Walker," she began, her voice carrying across the room, "can you explain why you questioned General Richardson's first-class ticket on the day of the incident?" Walker shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I was just doing my job," he said. "It's my responsibility to ensure that passengers are where they're supposed to be." "And did you have any reason to believe that General Richardson was not where she was supposed to be?" Eleanor pressed. Walker hesitated, glancing at the airline's defense team. Well, she was in uniform, and I just thought it was unusual. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. Unusual? In what way? Walker fidgeted with his hands. I mean, you don't see a lot of people like her in first class. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. The judge banged his gavel, calling for order, but the damage had been done. Walker's words hung in the air, a stark admission of the bias that had fueled his actions. Eleanor pounced. When you say people like her, are you referring to her military status, her gender, or her race? Walker stammered, his face flushing. I didn't mean anything by it. Eleanor's gaze was unrelenting. But you did mean something by it, didn't you, Mr. Walker? You saw a black woman in uniform holding a first-class ticket, and you assumed she didn't belong. That assumption wasn't based on her behavior, her credentials, or her ticket. It was based solely on your perception of who deserves to sit in first class. Walker's silence spoke volumes. Eleanor let the moment linger before returning to her seat, her expression one of quiet triumph. The ripple effect. That evening, Maya returned home to find her living room filled with boxes of letters and packages. Eric stood in the middle of the chaos, holding up a large envelope. Another batch of support letters, he said with a grin. It's like Christmas in here. Maya laughed softly, her heart swelling with gratitude. She opened a letter from an elderly woman in Texas who shared her own experience of discrimination decades earlier. Another package contained a handmade bracelet from a young girl in Detroit, along with a note that read, "You're my hero." Eric handed her a tablet. You need to see this. Maya's eyes widened as she scrolled through a news article. The protests organized at airports nationwide had grown exponentially. Thousands of people were showing up with signs that read, "Bias has no seat here, and we belong everywhere." Celebrities and public figures were joining the movement, using their platforms to amplify the message. This is bigger than I ever imagined, Maya murmured. Eric placed a hand on her shoulder. That's because you gave people a voice, Maya. You showed them that standing up matters. A divisive defense. The airline's defense team grew more aggressive as the trial continued. Richard Ellis, their lead attorney, attempted to shift the narrative, portraying Maya as someone who was exploiting the situation for personal gain. During cross-examination, Ellis questioned her motives. General Richardson, Ellis began, his tone smooth but condescending. You've become quite the public figure since this incident. Your story has been featured on national news. You've gained a significant social media following, and you've even been called a hero by some. Would you say this lawsuit has benefited you personally? Maya met his gaze, her expression unflinching. This lawsuit isn't about me, she said firmly. It's about addressing a system that allows discrimination to go unchecked. If speaking out makes me a public figure, then so be it. But I trade every bit of recognition to ensure that no one else has to experience what I did. Ellis smirked. So, you're saying this isn't about personal gain. This is about justice, Maya shot back. This is about accountability. And if you think I'm doing this for fame, you clearly don't understand what it means to fight for something bigger than yourself. The gallery erupted in applause, the judge once again calling for order. Maya's words resonated not just with the jury but with everyone in the room. The climax. As the trial neared its conclusion, Eleanor delivered a powerful closing argument. She spoke of Maya's service to her country, her dedication to her family, and her courage in standing up against prejudice. This case isn't just about one woman, Eleanor said, her voice steady and impassioned. It's about a system that needs to change. General Richardson didn't ask for this fight, but she took it on because she knew it was necessary. The question before you was simple. Do we continue to allow bias to dictate who belongs and who doesn't? Or do we take a stand and say, no more? The jury deliberated for 2 days. During that time, Maya waited anxiously, her family and supporters by her side. When the verdict was finally read, the courtroom was packed to capacity. We find in favor of the plaintiff, General Maya Richardson, the foreperson announced. The airline is found liable for racial discrimination and ordered to pay damages. Furthermore, the court recommends mandatory anti-bias training for all airline staff. Maya closed her eyes, a wave of relief washing over her. She had won, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. A new chapter. The victory sparked a chain reaction. Other companies began reevaluating their policies, and lawmakers introduced legislation mandating anti-bias training in the transportation industry. Maya's story continued to inspire, her name becoming synonymous with resilience and change. But for Maya, the fight was never about fame or recognition. It was about creating a world where her children, Olivia and Malik, could grow up without having to prove their worth at every turn. As she stood on the steps of the courthouse, surrounded by supporters, Maya felt a sense of hope she hadn't felt in years. This wasn't the end of her journey. It was the beginning of something much greater. A legacy of change. The courtroom victory was a moment Maya Richardson would never forget. But she knew it wasn't the end of the battle. It was the start of a new chapter. The months that followed were a whirlwind of interviews, speaking engagements, and advocacy work. She had become the face of a movement, a responsibility she carried with pride, but also with an acute awareness of its weight. The victory had sent shockwaves through the airline industry and beyond. Companies scrambled to update their policies, implement training programs, and publicly pledge their commitment to equity. But Maya wasn't naive. She knew these changes, while promising, were only the beginning. One morning, as sunlight streamed into her living room, Maya sat at the kitchen table with her husband, Eric, sipping her coffee. She was reading an email from Eleanor Briggs, her attorney and now a close ally. The email outlined the next steps for the broader initiative they had begun to call the Belonging Project. "This is it," Maya said, setting her cup down. "The real work starts now." Eric looked up from his tablet, a proud smile tugging at his lips. "You've already moved mountains, Maya. What's next?" Maya leaned back in her chair, her gaze distant but determined. Policy changes, community education, and making sure the people who face this kind of discrimination have a voice. We've won one battle, but the war isn't over. The Belonging Project. Maya and Eleanor launched the Belonging Project 6 months after the verdict. It was a multi-pronged initiative aimed at combating systemic bias in industries where discrimination often went unchecked. The project focused on 3 key areas: policy advocacy, corporate accountability, and public education. Policy advocacy. Maya traveled to Washington, D.C., several times to meet with lawmakers. With Eleanor's legal expertise and the backing of civil rights organizations, they lobbied for federal legislation that would require anti-bias training across all public-facing industries. The proposed bill, called the Bias Accountability Act, aimed to make such training mandatory for airlines, transportation services, and major corporations. Corporate accountability. The lawsuit had already set a precedent, but Maya wanted to ensure it wasn't just a symbolic victory. She worked with a team of consultants to create a standardized anti-bias training program tailored to industries with significant customer interaction. The program was designed to go beyond surface-level diversity talks, addressing implicit biases, systemic inequities, and strategies for meaningful inclusion. Public education. Maya began speaking at schools, universities, and community centers, sharing her story and encouraging others to stand up against injustice. She wanted to inspire the next generation to believe in their power to create change. Her talks were met with standing ovations, her words resonating deeply with audiences of all ages and backgrounds. A movement beyond borders. As the Belonging Project gained momentum, its impact reached far beyond the United States. International organizations invited Maya to speak at global conferences on equity and inclusion. Her story became a catalyst for similar movements in other countries, sparking conversations about privilege, access, and systemic discrimination. One such invitation came from the United Nations. Maya was asked to deliver a keynote address at a summit on human rights and global equity. Standing before an audience of world leaders, activists, and diplomats, Maya spoke with the same quiet strength that had carried her through every battle. "Change isn't comfortable," she said, her voice echoing through the grand hall. "It challenges the status quo, forces us to confront our biases, and demands accountability. But change is necessary. It's not just about creating policies. It's about creating a culture where everyone belongs." Her words were met with a standing ovation, the room buzzing with energy and hope. A personal reckoning. Despite her public success, Maya faced personal challenges. The pressure of being in the spotlight weighed heavily on her, and she often worried about how it might affect her family. Olivia, now 15, had begun to navigate her own battles with identity and belonging. She struggled with classmates who questioned her accomplishments, suggesting she only succeeded because of her mother's notoriety. One evening, Olivia confronted Maya in the kitchen, her face flushed with frustration. "Mom, do you ever get tired of it?" she asked. "Of having to prove yourself over and over again?" Maya paused, setting down the plate she was washing. She dried her hands and turned to face her daughter. "Every day," she admitted. "But that's why I keep fighting. Because one day, I want you and Malik to live in a world where you don't have to prove your worth to anyone." Olivia's expression softened, and she nodded. "I just want people to see me for who I am, not who you are." Maya smiled, pulling her daughter into a hug. "They will live. You're incredible, and anyone who can't see that doesn't matter." A letter from the past. One afternoon, as Maya sorted through a stack of mail, she found an envelope with no return address. Inside was a handwritten letter from Kara, the flight attendant who had stood up for her during the incident on the plane. "Maya," the letter began, "I've been following your journey since that day on the flight, and I want you to know how proud I am to have been a small part of it. What you've done is extraordinary, not just for yourself, but for so many others. You showed me that standing up, even in small ways, can create ripples of change. That day, I saw the strength in you, but now the whole world sees it too. Thank you for inspiring me and so many others to be better, to do better. I'll always be cheering you on. Warmly, Kara." Maya read the letter twice, her chest tightening with emotion. She placed it in her desk drawer alongside the other letters she had kept, each one a reminder of the lives she had touched. The road ahead. 2 years after the trial, Maya stood on a stage in Atlanta, addressing a crowd of thousands gathered for the annual Belonging Summit. The event had become a cornerstone of the movement, bringing together leaders, activists, and everyday people committed to equity and inclusion. "Today, we celebrate progress," Maya said, her voice strong and clear. "But we also acknowledge the work still ahead. Belonging isn't just a policy, it's a promise. A promise that every person, regardless of who they are, has the right to exist, to thrive, and to be seen." The crowd erupted in applause, the energy palpable. As Maya looked out at the sea of faces, young and old, of every race and background, she felt a profound sense of purpose. Her journey had begun with a moment of humiliation, but it had transformed into a movement that would shape the future. Maya knew the fight for justice and equality was far from over, but she also knew she wasn't fighting alone. She was no longer just General Maya Richardson. She was a leader, an advocate, and a symbol of what could be achieved when one person refused to stay silent. And this was only the beginning. The legacy secured. The Belonging Summit marked a milestone, not just for Maya Richardson, but for the movement that had blossomed under her leadership. Yet even as she celebrated the victories, Maya was acutely aware that change was a constant battle, one that required vigilance and sustained effort. After the summit, Maya found herself sitting in a quiet room backstage, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. She thought about the moments of doubt, the sleepless nights, and the sacrifices her family had made to support her. She thought about the countless people who had reached out, their stories a testament to the pervasiveness of discrimination and the resilience of the human spirit. Her thoughts were interrupted by Eleanor Briggs, who entered the room carrying 2 glasses of sparkling water. "I think you've earned this," Eleanor said, handing one to Maya. Maya chuckled softly, taking the glass. "We've earned this," she corrected. "I couldn't have done this without you." Eleanor sat down beside her, a rare moment of relaxation in their otherwise relentless schedules. "You know," Eleanor began, "this started as a case about one airline. Now it's about so much more. You've done something incredible, Maya." Maya looked down at the glass in her hands. "It still feels like there's so much left to do." "There always will be," Eleanor said gently. "But that's the nature of change. You've built a foundation. Others will carry it forward." Maya nodded, feeling the truth of those words. The movement had grown beyond her. It belonged to everyone who believed in its message. A new opportunity. Several months later, Maya received an unexpected call from a high-ranking official in the Department of Transportation. They wanted her to lead a newly formed Equity and Accountability Task Force, a federal initiative aimed at addressing systemic bias in public transportation and other industries. At first, Maya hesitated. She had already given so much of herself to this fight. But Eric, as always, provided clarity. "This isn't just another job," he said one evening as they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset. "This is a chance to take everything you fought for and institutionalize it, to make sure it lasts." Maya looked at him, her heart full of gratitude. "You always know what to say." Eric grinned. "That's why you married me." With his encouragement and the support of her children, Maya accepted the role. The task force quickly became a cornerstone of the federal government's efforts to combat discrimination, its policies informed by Maya's experiences and the stories of countless others. The personal side of change. Amid her public responsibilities, Maya remained deeply connected to her family. Olivia, now a confident and articulate teenager, had become an outspoken advocate for equity in her own right. She often accompanied Maya to speaking engagements, sharing her perspective as a young woman navigating a world still rife with challenges. Malik, now 8, had taken to wearing a miniature version of his mother's uniform during school presentations, proudly telling his classmates about his hero mom. Maya's heart swelled with pride every time she saw the way her children carried themselves, aware of their worth and unafraid to demand respect. But Maya also made sure to create moments of normalcy. Whether it was family game nights, weekend hikes, or simply cooking dinner together, she cherished these times as a reminder of why she fought so hard. Her family grounded her, gave her purpose, and kept her heart full. The final chapter. 10 years after the trial, Maya stood at a podium in front of a massive crowd gathered at the National Mall. The Bias Accountability Act had passed into law, and the moment was being celebrated as a historic victory for equity and justice. Her hair now streaked with gray, Maya's presence commanded respect and admiration. As she looked out at the crowd, she saw the faces of activists, lawmakers, and ordinary citizens who had joined the fight. She also saw her family, Eric, Olivia, and Malik, standing proudly in the front row. "This isn't the end of our journey," Maya began, her voice steady and strong. "It's a reminder that change is possible when we refuse to accept the unacceptable. When we speak out, when we stand together, we create a future where everyone belongs." The crowd erupted in applause, the sound reverberating through the air. Maya stepped back from the podium, her heart full. A legacy of belonging. In the years that followed, Maya's story became a part of history. Schools taught about the belonging movement, its principles inspiring new generations. Her children carried forward her legacy in their own ways, Olivia as a human rights attorney and Malik as an educator who emphasized the importance of inclusion. Maya eventually retired from public life, but her impact endured. She spent her later years mentoring young leaders, ensuring they had the tools and confidence to continue the fight for justice. One quiet afternoon, as she sat on the porch of her home, Eric by her side, Maya reflected on her journey. She thought about the woman she had been on that plane, standing tall against a man who had tried to diminish her. She thought about the countless people who would join her fight, their voices creating a symphony of change. "You did it," Eric said, breaking the silence. "You built something that will outlast all of us." Maya smiled, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "We did it," she corrected, her hand resting over his. "Together." And as the sun set on another day, Maya Richardson felt at peace, knowing her life had been spent in service of something greater, a world where everyone belonged.